Hello everybody, it's Mrs. Ware of Stream English here, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to analyze narrative viewpoint. Now, this is a structural device, so those of you who have to analyze the structure of a fiction text for any of your exam questions will hopefully find this really useful. So let's get started. First of all, we need to start by making sure we understand what narrative viewpoint is and the different kinds of narrative viewpoint a writer can use in their work. You're probably most familiar with the three main kind of overarching types of narrative viewpoint: first person, second person, and third person. All of these basically refer to who is telling the story. With first person, there is a character in the story that is telling the story, so it uses the first person pronoun I. With second person, this is the rarest you will find by far, and writers only tend to use this for like a small part of their novel because otherwise it gets really annoying. Second person is where the writer writes as if you are telling the story. You are a small child. You are walking down the street. You can see why that would get annoying really, really quickly. And then finally, you've got third person, where the characters in the story are not the ones telling the story, it's somebody outside of the story. Now, in the case of third person, who the narrator is doesn't matter. They're not supposed to be like a character themselves. It's almost just as if, almost like you're a kind of god watching down as your little minions go about their business. You're kind of not involved in the story, you're just telling it. So that's your third person, and that will typically use pronouns like he and she and that kind of thing. Within the first, second, third person, there are a couple of other things that we consider as well. The first is whether the viewpoint is internal or external. Internal means that we get the thoughts and feelings of the characters in the story. External means we get a description of what the characters are doing, or we get dialogue of what they're saying, but we don't get any insight into what they're thinking or feeling. A first-person narrative is always going to be internal onto the first person who is telling the story, but external on everybody else, because you have no idea. They only know about themselves. They don't know how everybody else is feeling. Third person can mix and match depending on what it wants. So third person can be external, but it could also be internal as well. Second person, I don't even want to talk about second person really. It's such a rare one that people use. But again, second person has that ability to mix and match. You know, it could be internal. In fact, no, because it's technically almost like a first person of yourself. So it's going to be internal, isn't it? That'd be really weird if it was you, but you never think about how you feel. It's just, second person, just no. Once we then know whether a text is internal or external, we can then think about how many characters is the text internal or external for. If a text is only internal for one character, we might call that a limited narrative viewpoint. Now, limited narrative viewpoint is not necessarily just one character, maybe like just limited to a small number, like 1 or 2 or max 3 really. Limited internal viewpoints mean, for example, if we take the Harry Potters, we know how Harry Potter is feeling and what he's thinking, but we don't know what Hermione or Ron or Snape are thinking and feeling. We only get their external descriptions of what they're doing, what they look like, and all the dialogue that they're saying. Conversely, you can also have omniscient viewpoint. That is where the narrator basically has the ability to jump into everybody's brains and go through what any character is thinking or feeling. So if we think back again to first person, second person, and third person, your first person and your second person are going to be limited. They're going to be limited to that one person who is telling the story. Third person has more flexibility of getting to choose. Third person, again, like the Harry Potters, could be limited to 1 or 2 characters, but it can also be omniscient, and you hear about all of the characters as well. So with that in mind, you can see that the first person narrative viewpoint always has an internal limited viewpoint. Pretty straightforward. So whenever you identify that a text is first person, you've also immediately identified that it is limited and it is internal. Ditto if you get second person on the weirdly rare chance that you will get that. If you get third person, on the other hand, you are going to have to think a bit more carefully, look a bit more at how the story is told to figure out, okay, can I see characters' feelings or not? How many characters' feelings can I see? Or, is it all of them or is it just one? That kind of thing, in order to narrow down what kind of viewpoint it is. Because of how much more varied third person can be compared to first or second, it also can affect how you would talk about it. So with first person, there is no point saying, this text has a first person internal limited viewpoint. Because every text has a first person, every text that is first person has a first person limited internal viewpoint. On the other hand, with third person, it's worth specifying those details because it can be different. So it's worth saying that this is a third person internal omniscient text, or a third person external omniscient text, or whatever it is. Well, no, if it's external, it's not going to be limited or omniscient. That's specific to internal. You get what I'm talking about. Point is, third person, you can apply more of this terminology. First person, you know that terminology, but you don't have to list it out when you're identifying what the narrative viewpoint is. So now that we know what the different kinds of narrative viewpoint are, the next question is, how do we analyze it? Well, the key to answering that question is that we have to think about, why would the writer have chosen that narrative viewpoint? And the kind of generic answer to that is because essentially the plot of a novel is all about controlling when the reader gets information and how they get information. Of course, the author of a story already knows the full thing. They know everything that's going to happen, but they want to control when you find stuff out. And the narrative viewpoint is one of the ways that they can do that. For an example, we've got a text here from a novel called The Bricks That Built the Houses by Kate Tempest. And this extract from the novel is an external viewpoint. Keep in mind that with third person, are not necessarily external all of the time. They can go kind of back and forth depending on what works for the effect that they're trying to create. To start off with, I want us just to read this little extract. As I'm reading it, I want you to be thinking about, how does using the external, focusing on description of what's happening, what characters are doing, dialogue, but not giving us any information about what they're thinking, how does that affect our understanding as a reader of what is going on? So that's what you're going to think about as I now read. They leave town in a fourth-hand Ford Cortina. It's night and the city is full of itself. There is thunder in the sky, the kind of clouds that make you bow your head. They are heading for the motorway. Leon is driving, his shirt damp with sweat, his arms sore at the wrists from gripping the wheel. He sits low down in the driver's seat, but the top of his head still kisses the roof of the car. Leon is muscular, built like a fighting dog, 6'2" and light on his feet. His movements are liquid slick. His face is screwed up with worry as he turns left down the roads he's always known and pushes the tired engine up Blackheath Hill towards the A2 roundabout, weaving between the clattering suction of the heavy goods lorries. Harry's in the back, one arm stretched across the top of the seats, drumming her fingers, shifting her weight. She is small and getting smaller every second. Her little body hunched in the back of the car, her limbs splayed like the arms of a broken umbrella, jittering. She clutches the brown suitcase that rests on her lap. She grips the handle so tight its stitches are imprinted on her palm. Fear knots her shoulders and they spike together at her back like folded wings. Becky's in the front. Her legs are crossed tightly. Her elbows are tucked into her hips. She's biting her thumbnail. Her body is taut as a tripwire. Her features are soft and generous like the faces carved in stone on temples. Nose pierced with a shining stud. A mouth that turns up at the corners. Tall and straight back with a commanding presence. Her dark eyes stare at the dark road while the dark car shakes on its wheels. Becky watches the wing mirrors, noticing every movement, every fierce headlight. Harry watches the cars behind. Leon keeps his eyes on the road. If someone is coming after them, there isn't much they can do but keep going. So, what do you think? What effect does that external narrative viewpoint have on us as a reader? I am about to talk about kind of the answer, the valid interpretation. However, if you want to kind of get your thoughts in first, make sure you comment below, hit pause, comment below what you think, and then you can come back and feel validated that we had the same idea. So in this text then, the effect of the external. Well, we definitely get a sense that something bad has happened. There's this real tension in the text. All of the characters are clearly very afraid. However, because there's no internal narrative, we don't know why. We don't know what they're afraid of. We don't know necessarily the exact specifics of what's going on until that very last line, where suddenly it becomes much more internal. If someone is coming after them, there isn't much they can do but keep going. Now that last line is suddenly giving us an insight into Leon's mindset, and we're suddenly getting that sense of, that's why they're afraid. So what Kate Tempest has brilliantly done is she's withheld that information from us. She's withheld the thoughts and feelings, because that would have given the game away. They would have been sat there thinking, oh, I'm really scared, somebody's coming after me. Instead, she's focused on showing us their fear, but leaving us with that mystery of why they're afraid. And then she uses that shift to the internal in that very last sentence to kind of give us that bit more information there. So what you can see is that we've got a writer using their narrative viewpoint as a way of building tension and kind of suspense because of the information that we as a reader do not have. Awesome, right? Next, we're going to have a look at how the internal viewpoint can be used really masterfully by writers. And for this, we're going to turn to Harry Potter. Now, I'm actually pretty impressed at how many videos I've managed to get through and not mention Harry Potter once. So I'm just going to lean in to my Harry Potter fandom here. I know, an English teacher loves Harry Potter, so cliche, blah, blah, blah. I don't care. I am a Ravenclaw. No, that's not true. I'm a Slytherin. But I love Harry Potter, and I'm going to milk the opportunity to talk about it now. So we're going to have a look at this extract from Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Now, I'm not even going to say spoiler alert here because you have had plenty of time to read the books / watch the films. So I'm going to start off by giving just the necessary background that you need to understand up to this point, and then I'll read the extract. So as I've already mentioned, Harry Potter is written in a third-person limited viewpoint. That means that we get the thoughts and feelings of Harry and only Harry. Everybody else is external. And at this point of the book, the gist you need to know is that Ron is about to try and destroy a magical object that basically tries to put you off destroying it by casting projections, hallucinations, I guess you could call them, that try and mess with your head. So in this extract, we're going to see how these creatures, this magical vision, tries to mess with his head and then how he responds. So let's read. As I read, I want you to be thinking about what is the impact of having the internal on Harry, but the external on Ron. Here we go. Who wouldn't prefer him? What woman would take you? You are nothing, nothing, nothing to him, crooned Riddle Hermione, and she stretched like a snake and entwined herself around Riddle Harry, wrapping him in a close embrace. Their lips met. On the ground in front of them, Ron's face filled with anguish. He raised the sword high, his arms shaking. "Do it, Ron!" Harry yelled. Ron looked towards him, and Harry thought he saw a trace of scarlet in his eyes. Ron? The sword flashed, plunged. Harry threw himself out of the way. There was a clang of metal and a long, drawn-out scream. Harry whirled round, slipping in the snow, wand held ready to defend himself. But there was nothing to fight. The monstrous versions of himself and Hermione were gone. There was only Ron, standing there with the sword held slackly in his hand, looking down at the shattered remains of the locket on the flat rock. Slowly, Harry walked back to him, hardly knowing what to say or do. Ron was breathing heavily. His eyes were no longer red at all, but their normal blue. They were also wet. The sword clanged as Ron dropped it. He had sunk to his knees, his head in his arms. He was shaking, but not, Harry realised, from cold. Harry crammed the broken locket into his pocket, knelt down beside Ron, and placed a hand cautiously on his shoulder. He took it as a good sign that Ron did not throw it off. Oh man, I need to go reread all the Harry Potters now. This has just tantalized me, you know? So, same as before, I'm about to explain what the impact is of this third person internal viewpoint. But before I do, pause and comment below and tell me what you are thinking. Okay, so this viewpoint is brilliant because this is the 7th Harry Potter book, and for all 7 books, we've not gotten an insight into kind of Ron's thoughts. We've always had to infer what we think is going on with Ron based on basically what Harry thinks. As you can see in lines like, he took it as a good sign that Ron did not throw it off. It's Harry interpreting Ron's behavior, and we as a reader like, interesting observation, Harry. This probably means this about Ron, or this about Ron, or this about Ron. What was brilliant about the Horcrux, the magical object that caused these like hallucinations. Well, hallucinations is not the right. It's magical stuff, okay? The magical vision that it caused for Ron. The great thing about that is that it gave J.K. Rowling the ability to go internal on Ron for a minute. It gave her the ability to reveal Ron's thoughts and feelings. And basically what it reveals, as we can see in this extract here, as well as what we get in the earlier pages that come before this, is just Ron's crippling insecurity, the feeling that he isn't good enough, that his mother doesn't think he's good enough, that the woman he loves doesn't think he's good enough, and that everybody would basically much rather have Harry, that kind of insecurity he has when comparing himself to Harry. So she was able to use this to give us that internal to understand him. But then, once the locket's destroyed, Ron's back to being external again. So we're back to being external in having to figure out how he is processing these events. And of course we get some obvious clues, you know, the fact that his eyes are wet, he's crying, the fact that he was shaking, but not from the cold. We kind of infer from that of like how much this moment has affected him emotionally, the fact that he's shaking. So it's such a brilliant like use of that being able to shift from internal to external, because we finally got that insight into how Ron is feeling, and then we just pull back out again and having to interpret how he's processing it afterwards. But getting that internal just for a moment, oh, I don't know about you, but my heart broke for Ron. I just wanted to be like, no, they're like a brother and sister. They don't really love each other. It's okay, Ron. You're good enough. You're the one with the sense of humor around here. Everybody loves you, etc. And that's so brilliant because that came from that internal of telling us how he felt, so we as a reader could really relate and empathize with him. But then, yeah, back to that external again where we don't know really how he's feeling. It was also brilliant from the internal on Harry perspective, because Harry is having to kind of figure out what's going on with Ron, and we see him trying to do that. We see him trying to process, you know, the information he's getting of what Ron's doing and what Ron looks like, and trying to process what that means. And that's one of the beauties of the limited viewpoint, first person or third person. When things are limited to that one main character's viewpoint, you're dealing with to a certain extent, unreliable narrator. Can you trust? Like, nothing is objective in what they're describing. It's all coming through the subjective filter of that main character's perspective. So if that main character perceives something as bad, when actually it wasn't bad, and that kind of stuff. Another classic Harry Potter example of that would just be how many times Severus Snape was trying to save Harry's butt over the series of 7 books. Meanwhile, Harry was perceiving him as like the most kind of cruel and evil person ever. That'd be another classic example there. But I couldn't do that extract because, number one, I'd have to write out too much, and, you know, I'd probably get like sued by some book publishers or something. But also, two, that moment, I'm not ready. I'm not emotionally ready to return to that moment. So I went for this one instead. But yeah, what you can see here is the basic idea of the power of the internal narrative viewpoint, all about biasing our perceptions of events based on what the main character is thinking. So external is about not giving us that information and leaving us kind of wondering like, oh, what's going on? And just trying to kind of piece together clues from the description. Internal gives us information, but is limited to one perspective. And so we're viewing the events of the novel from that very one angle, and that could lead to us like deliberately on the part of the author because they want us to, like, misunderstanding or not fully understanding situations. It can also create a dramatic irony. For that, I'm thinking of novels like, if you know it, Pigeon English. The name of the author escapes me right now. It's Stephen something. But Pigeon English, actually also The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, if you know that novel, they are both, oh, and the novel Room. Oh man, I'm just going to keep listing books. Point is, all of those three are written from the perspective of children. First person or third person limited from the perspective of children. And so what the writers are able to do is they're able to keep it limited to that child, but give the reader enough clues that the reader figures out what's going on. And it creates this, like, usually haunting, painfully emotional, dramatic irony where basically we as the reader recognize that that child is just walking into a bear trap of a bad situation and they have, they're in blissful ignorance with no idea what's about to happen. So again, it's that the writer is controlling how much information we get and how much information the character has in order to have an effect on us and make us feel a certain way about the plot that we're looking at. The final text we're going to have a look at is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Now, this video is quickly becoming my favourite I've ever recorded just because I've gotten to look at 3 of my favourite books all in one video. But again, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information to this one just for you to be able to understand it. So the basic gist is we've got 2 main characters, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth. He is too prejudiced, he's upper class, looking down as her as like upper middle class, and she has too much pride. She's not willing to kind of look past being insulted by him to kind of consider loving him. They both just kind of keep clashing because, they're clearly in love with each other and there's all this kind of other stuff stopping them from ever managing to get together. So in this little extract that we're about to read, Mr. Darcy is about to kind of confess his love for Elizabeth, and then she is going to be like, nah. And that's basically because of the way that he expresses his love for her, as you'll see in a second. Now, this one is written with a third-person omniscient narrator. So we're going to get to see inside both Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth's heads. So again, as I'm reading, what I want you to be thinking about is what is the effect on us as a reader by getting to know both sides. And one other little thing to look out for is you'll see kind of in the middle of the text as I'm reading a little like square brackets with 3 dots in it. All that means is I've skipped a little bit of text in order to jump to something that happens later. So let's have a read. He sat down for a few moments and then getting up walked about the room. Elizabeth was surprised but said not a word. After a silence of several minutes he came towards her in an agitated manner and thus began. In vain I have struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression. She stared, coloured, doubted, and was silent. This he considered sufficient encouragement, and the avowal of all that he felt and had long felt for her immediately followed. He spoke well, but there were feelings besides those of the heart to be detailed, and he was not more eloquent on the subject of his tenderness than of pride. His sense of her inferiority, of its being a degradation, of the family obstacles which had always opposed to inclination, were dwelt on with a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding, but was very unlikely to recommend his suit. Skip a bit. Mr. Darcy, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his eyes fixed on her face, seemed to catch her words with no less resentment than surprise. His complexion became pale with anger, and the disturbance of his mind was visible in every feature. He was struggling for the appearance of composure, and would not open his lips till he believed himself to have attained it. The pause was to Elizabeth's feelings dreadful. At length, with a voice of forced calmness, he said, "And this is all the reply which I am to have the honour of expecting? I might perhaps wish to be informed why, with so little endeavour at civility, I am thus rejected. But it is of small importance." So what we've got here is 2 main characters that just cannot see eye to eye. And therefore, by using the internal narrative viewpoint, Jane Austen, I was about to tell you what it does. Comment below if you want to get your thought in first. What Jane Austen does is she is able to help us as a reader see both sides. We're not just biased for Mr. Darcy or for Elizabeth, we get kind of both angles. And from that, we as a reader are able to kind of look more at the complexity of the situation and be like, oh, come on, but I understand where he's coming from because I know his thoughts, but I also understand where she's coming from because I know her thoughts. And it helps give us that more kind of well-rounded picture of events. Again, that also therefore creates almost a kind of dramatic irony for us as a reader, because of course Elizabeth doesn't know what Mr. Darcy is thinking, nor does Mr. Darcy know what Elizabeth is thinking. So we as the reader have almost the most information compared to our characters. So what we can see here is how they've basically misunderstood each other. So when Elizabeth is described as like staring, coloured, doubting and silent, because of that internal narrative viewpoint, we know that Mr. Darcy has interpreted this as encouragement and then has kept talking and talking. When actually, because we know Elizabeth, we know that she's like, oh man, what's going on here with this guy that like has just been, you know, a bit aloof and unkind and all this kind of stuff, and now he's telling me he loves me? What? Similarly, once Elizabeth has rejected him and we shift to getting more of a side of Mr. Darcy's external description of what he looks like, but we then have the pause was to Elizabeth's feelings dreadful, we get this really nice ability to get a sense of how everybody's feeling in the scene, because we've got that description of Mr. Darcy from that emotion perspective of describing what his face is doing and describing pale with anger and the disturbance of his mind. But we also have like, oh, Elizabeth really doesn't like this kind of awkwardness and how it's hurting him either. So we're getting the most kind of complete picture to help us fully understand. And again, it's not fully understanding in the sense of the writer wants us to know absolutely everything at all times. It's that the omniscient narrator allows the writer to convey which bits of information they want at the right times. Because even within omniscient narrator, the writer is constantly making decisions of, okay, who am I going to tell you about? Whose thoughts and feelings am I going to reveal at what points and in what order? And just the very act of that is something that can be analysed. You know, if one character's thoughts and feelings will come out first and then it's another character, why that order? Why not the other way around? If the writer hasn't told us a character's thoughts or feelings for a little while and then suddenly does start to give it in quite a lot of detail, why? Why do it that way? There's loads of different decisions that a writer is having to make when they're using omniscient narrator, because there's so many different potential people they could give the thoughts and feelings of. So you've always got to consider, why give us that person's thoughts and feelings at that point? How does it affect our understanding of what's going on in the story at that point? And then when we gain more picture from somebody else's thoughts and feelings, how does it develop our understanding of the story as well? So once again, omniscient narrative viewpoint is about controlling the amount of information that we as a reader are getting in order to have an effect on us. But the difference is, compared to your limited narrative viewpoints for first and third and second person, the omniscient narrator has a lot more decisions to make in when and where they choose to reveal thoughts and feelings of the different characters. Overall then, when we think about how we can analyze narrative viewpoint, there's two main ways that we can do it. Way number one is if you are answering a question where you are only allowed to analyze structure. I'm looking at you, AQA Language GCSE Paper 1 Question 3. If you're only allowed to analyze structure, then you're going to need to analyze the narrative viewpoint on its own. And what you can essentially ask yourself is, on a whole, from looking at the whole text, what is the impact of the amount of information that we get at different points of the story? What is the impact of the amount of information we get at the beginning due to the narrative viewpoint, in the middle due to the narrative viewpoint, at the end due to the narrative viewpoint? The second way of analysing narrative viewpoint is to analyse it in connection with language. This is the much easier and better path to go down for any exam question where you're allowed to analyse both language and structure. And that will apply for you if you're studying a lot of like GCSE literature, but also things like, again, the language GCSE Paper 1 Question 4 as well. And what you're able to do there is, first of all, analyze the language. Okay, so how the language conveys whatever idea it is. So perhaps something like, oh, I don't know, conveys the insecurity of Ron, for example. and you can analyze how the language conveys Ron's insecurities, and then you can say this is further reinforced by the narrative viewpoint, and then you can analyze how the narrative viewpoint adds to that effect. So that's two different paths there. If it's just looking at narrative viewpoint on its own, you're just going to be looking at how the lack of information or the giving of information at particular points in a text affects our understanding of what's going on. If you're looking at it with the relationship of language, look at the language first and then ask yourself, how does the narrative viewpoint reinforce that idea? Again, via the by the information that it is giving us or that it is withholding from us.